In the summer of 1945, as the guns of the Second World War finally fell silent across a shattered Europe, something extraordinary was happening on the quiet plains of Kansas, the pine forests of Colorado, and the sun-baked flatlands of Texas. Something so strange, so deeply human, and so completely at odds with everything the Nazi regime had promised its soldiers that historians would spend decades trying to fully understand it. German prisoners of war, men who had marched under the swastika, who had sworn oaths to Adolf Hitler, who had been raised on a diet of propaganda, telling them that America was a decadent, mongrel nation unworthy of respect, were writing desperate letters to the United States government, begging, pleading not to be sent home. They had arrived as enemies. They were leaving, many of them, as something far more complicated. And the story of how that transformation happened is one of the most quietly astonishing chapters of the entire war. A chapter that begins not with a battle, but with a bowl of ice cream. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States processed and housed approximately 425,000 German prisoners of war on American soil, the largest such operation in the nation's history, and the sheer scale of the undertaking was staggering. These men were held in over 500 base camps and branch camps spread across 46 states, from the rural South to the Pacific Northwest, from the deserts of Arizona to the dairy farms of Wisconsin. The legal framework governing their treatment was the Geneva Convention of 1929, a document that the United States took seriously to a degree that would have seemed almost incomprehensible to the men who first stepped off the transport ships at ports along the eastern seaboard. The convention mandated humane treatment, adequate food, shelter, and medical care. And the Americans, partly out of genuine moral commitment and partly out of a calculated desire to ensure reciprocal treatment for American POWs held in Germany, adhered to its standards with remarkable fidelity. What the convention did not and could not anticipate was the psychological earthquake that compliance would trigger in men who had spent years inside the ideological fortress of National Socialism. The first wave of German prisoners arrived in significant numbers following the North African campaign of 1942 and 1943, when the surrender of Axis forces in Tunisia delivered nearly 250,000 prisoners to Allied hands at a single stroke. Many of these men were veterans of Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps, battle-hardened, ideologically committed, and deeply skeptical of what awaited them on the other side of the Atlantic. They had been told by their officers and by the Nazi propaganda apparatus that America was weak, chaotic, racially inferior, and incapable of mounting the kind of sustained industrial and military effort that a serious war demanded. Then they arrived. The processing experience alone was a kind of slow-motion shock. Men who had been subsisting on reduced rations in the final days of the North African campaign were served meals that exceeded the dietary standards of many American civilians. The Army's own regulations required that prisoners receive the same caloric intake as American enlisted men, roughly 3,600 calories per day, and the menus included meat, potatoes, bread, vegetables, desserts, and coffee. One prisoner, a sergeant from Hanover named Werner Burkert, later recalled that he had stood in the mess line at Camp McCain in Mississippi, holding a tray loaded with more food than he had seen in a single meal in over 2 years, and that he had simply stood there, unable to move, until a fellow prisoner nudged him forward. Another man, captured after the fall of Tunis, reportedly wept when he was handed a chocolate bar by an American guard, not from gratitude, but from the dawning, vertigo-inducing realization that everything he had been told about America might have been a lie. The camps themselves ranged in quality from the very good to the genuinely excellent, and the conditions within them were a source of ongoing astonishment to men accustomed to the brutal deprivations of the Eastern Front or the sun-scorched misery of the North African desert. Prisoners were housed in wooden barracks or, in some camps, in permanent brick structures. They had access to recreational facilities, libraries stocked with German language books, musical instruments, sports equipment, and in many camps, rudimentary theatres, where they staged productions for their fellow prisoners. The Army encouraged organised athletics, soccer, boxing and gymnastics were particularly popular, partly to maintain order and morale, and partly because idler prisoners were potentially dangerous ones. At Camp Forest, in Tennessee, prisoners organised a full orchestra. At Camp Ellis in Illinois, they produced theatrical performances that drew appreciative audiences from among their own ranks. At Camp Hearn in Texas, A prisoner with formal training established a painting studio that produced works of genuine artistic merit, some of which survive to this day in Texas archives. Work assignments took thousands of prisoners off the base camps and into the surrounding communities, and this dimension of the POW experience would prove to be among the most profoundly transformative. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted prisoners could be required to work, and the labor shortage created by the mobilization of millions of American men into the armed forces meant that German POWs became an indispensable component of the wartime agricultural economy. They harvested cotton in Arkansas, sugar beets in Nebraska, tomatoes in Maryland, apples in Washington state, and citrus in Florida. They worked in lumber mills, food processing plants, military installations, and farms of every description. The wages they earned were modest 80 cents per day by Army regulation, but they were paid in a scrip redeemable at the camp canteen, and the canteen itself was yet another revelation. Men who had grown up in a Germany of scarcity and wartime rationing walked into American camp canteens and found cigarettes, beer, candy bars, razor blades, writing paper, and a dozen other items that the German war economy had made vanishingly scarce. The abundance was not a performance. It was not staged for their benefit. It was simply the ordinary reality of American material life, and its effect on men who had been told their enemy was materially and morally inferior cannot be overstated. Contact with American civilians during work details added another layer of complexity to the prisoner's experience. In the fields and orchards and processing plants where they worked alongside American farm laborers and local workers, German prisoners discovered something that their ideological training had not prepared them for. Ordinary Americans who were neither the degenerate weaklings of Nazi propaganda nor the threatening monsters of wartime German caricature, but simply human beings who, more often than not, treated them with a matter-of-fact decency that was deeply disorienting. There were exceptions. Some communities were openly hostile, particularly in areas with high concentrations of Gold Star families, but the prevailing tone of these interactions was one of guarded normality and normal human contact, after years of total war and ideological saturation, was itself a radical experience. The most deliberate and consequential aspect of the American POW program, however, was the re-education effort that the War Department launched in the spring of 1944, under the auspices of a special branch known as the Intellectual Diversion Program, later renamed the Re-Education Program. The program was the brainchild of a group of army officers and civilian academics who recognized that the war would eventually end and that the hundreds of thousands of German prisoners on American soil represented a unique opportunity to send home a generation of men who understood democracy not as an abstraction, but as a lived reality. The intellectual architecture of the program was shaped in significant part by German and Austrian Jewish émigrés who had fled the Nazi regime and found positions in American universities, government agencies, and the military itself. These men, scholars, journalists, lawyers, and teachers, brought a particular urgency to the undertaking, because they understood from personal experience precisely what Nazism was and precisely what it would take to dislodge its grip from the minds of men who had grown up inside it. The centerpiece of the program was a newspaper called Der Ruf, which translates roughly as The Call, edited and written largely by German prisoners themselves under American supervision. Der Ruf was not crude propaganda. Its creators understood that heavy-handed ideological instruction would be immediately recognized and rejected by its intended audience. Instead, it offered serious intellectual content, political philosophy, cultural commentary, analyses of German history, and open discussions of the moral and practical failures of National Socialism, all written in the kind of sophisticated German that educated prisoners would take seriously. The circulation of Der Ruf eventually reached approximately 75,000 copies per week, making it one of the most widely read German-language publications in the world during the final years of the war. Alongside the newspaper, the program introduced carefully selected films, discussion groups, and lectures, and it screened documentaries about American democracy and about the crimes of the Nazi regime, including footage from the liberated concentration camps that many prisoners simply refused to believe was authentic until the accumulating weight of evidence and the testimony of men they trusted made denial impossible. The moment when the reality of the Holocaust broke through the psychological defenses of German prisoners in American camps was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, agonizing process of individual reckoning, and the accounts left by prisoners who underwent it are among the most searing documents of the entire era. One prisoner at Camp Ruston in Louisiana later wrote that he had spent 3 days unable to speak after watching footage from Buchenwald, not because he was grief-stricken in the conventional sense, but because the world he thought he had been fighting for had simply ceased to exist in his mind, and he did not yet know what to put in its place. Another man, a former NCO with the 21st Panzer Division, who had fought from France through the North African campaign, described the experience of seeing the camp's footage as similar to discovering that the house he had grown up in had been built on a foundation of human bones. The re-education program produced results that were uneven, contested, and deeply human in their complexity. Some prisoners, particularly those with deep ideological commitments or those in camps dominated by fanatical officers, remained resistant to the end. The camp at Papago Park in Arizona became notorious for its concentration of committed Nazis among the officer class, men who maintained strict hierarchical control over enlisted prisoners and enforced ideological conformity with techniques that ranged from social pressure to outright intimidation. A group of submarine officers at Papago Park organized the most successful POW escape of the war in December 1944, digging a tunnel 178 feet long that allowed 25 men to briefly reach freedom before being recaptured in the desert surrounding the camp. But even at Papago Park, the cracks showed. Enlisted men who found ways to interact with American civilians on work details came back changed, in small but unmistakable ways, and the officers who observed these changes understood that the greatest threat to ideological discipline was not American propaganda but American reality. The prisoners who were most profoundly transformed by their American experience were often those who came from working class or lower middle class backgrounds, men who had genuinely believed in the Nazi promise of a racially pure, economically vibrant Germany, and who discovered in America a version of that promise, abundance, opportunity, orderly civic life, that had been achieved without racial terror, without conquest, and without the systematic murder of millions. The cognitive dissonance this created was immense, and it resolved itself differently in different men, but a significant proportion resolved it in the same direction, by beginning, tentatively and often painfully, to question the premises of the world they had fought to defend. Among those men, a subset emerged who were not merely disillusioned with Nazism, but positively attracted to America, to its physical spaces, its social dynamics, its political culture, and in some cases to specific Americans they had come to know. Romances between German prisoners on work details and American women were officially prohibited and practically inevitable, and they occurred with sufficient frequency that the army issued multiple directives attempting to curtail them without notable success. More commonly, prisoners formed genuine friendships with American farm families who employed them, relationships built on the shared rhythms of agricultural labor, mutual curiosity, and the basic human impulse to see the person standing in front of you rather than the uniform they are wearing. A farmer in Nebraska named Henry Cohn, himself the grandson of German immigrants, employed a work detail of German prisoners for 2 consecutive harvest seasons and maintained correspondence with several of them for decades after the war. One of those men, a former corporal from Bavaria named Franz Wimmer, eventually immigrated legally to the United States in 1952 and settled within 50 miles of the farm where he had first worked as a prisoner, a resolution that was less anomalous than it might seem. As 1945 unfolded and the war in Europe moved toward its shattering conclusion, a quiet, bureaucratic drama was playing out in army offices and War Department corridors that would determine the fate of the men in the camps. The question of what to do with German prisoners after the war's end was complicated by competing pressures from multiple directions. The Soviet Union, which had sustained catastrophic losses and faced an enormous labor shortage, was demanding German prisoners for reparations work. France, whose economy had been devastated by 4 years of occupation, made similar demands. Britain, which had its own prisoner population to manage, was also navigating the repatriation question, with one eye on the reconstruction needs of the post-war order. The United States, operating under the Geneva Convention's requirement that prisoners be repatriated promptly after hostilities ended, found itself in a difficult position. It had legal obligations that pointed in one direction and strategic interests that pointed in several others. The decision was ultimately made to transfer a significant portion of the German prisoner population in American custody to France and Britain before repatriation, where they would be used as labour, a decision that was legally questionable under the convention and morally troubling to many of the army officers who had administered the camps in good conscience. For the prisoners themselves, the prospect of transfer to France or Britain was frightening, and the prospect of repatriation to a Germany that had been bombed into rubble and was now divided between occupying powers was terrifying in a different way. Many of the men in American custody came from areas that had fallen under Soviet occupation, and they had no desire whatsoever to return to what was rapidly becoming the German Democratic Republic. Others had received letters from home describing conditions of near-total devastation, cities in ruins, families scattered, the entire infrastructure of civilian life collapsed. Against this backdrop, America looked not merely comfortable but safe, and the letters that prisoners began writing to army authorities in the spring and summer of 1945 reflect a desperation that was entirely genuine. The petitions not to be repatriated took various forms. Some were individual letters, carefully composed in formal German or halting English, citing specific circumstances, a family connection to the American zone of occupation, a skill that might be of use to the occupation authorities, a fear of Soviet reprisal based on wartime service. Others were collective documents signed by dozens or even hundreds of prisoners from a single camp, making a general case for why men who had been exposed to American democracy and had come to value it should be permitted to remain in or return to the United States. A group of prisoners at Camp Concordia in Kansas submitted a formal petition in July 1945, arguing that their re-education had been so thorough and their commitment to democratic values so genuine that their deportation would be a waste of precisely the kind of human capital that the post-war reconstruction of Germany would most urgently need, a clever argument that was also, in many cases, sincerely meant. The Army's response to these petitions was sympathetic at the individual level and constrained at the institutional level. Officers who had administered camps and had come to know their prisoners as individuals were often genuinely reluctant to see them sent home to conditions that looked, from the vantage point of 1945, deeply unpromising, and some of them went to considerable lengths to delay repatriation for prisoners they considered vulnerable or valuable, but the institutional pressure for repatriation was overwhelming, and the legal framework of the Geneva Convention left little room for the kind of individual exceptions that both the prisoners and their American administrators sometimes wanted to make. The repatriation process itself, which unfolded through 1945 and into 1946, was for many prisoners a deeply emotional experience, and the accounts they left behind consistently describe the departure from American camps in terms that are strikingly at odds with what one might expect from men returning to their home country after years of captivity. Many described feeling, as they boarded the transport ships that would carry them back across the Atlantic, not relief at the prospect of going home, but grief at leaving a place that had become, in some sense they struggled to articulate, more real to them than the Germany they were returning to. One prisoner, a former infantryman from Cologne, whose camp had been in rural Georgia, described standing at the rail of his transport ship and watching the American coastline recede with the sensation of watching the only world he fully understood disappear behind him. Another man, repatriated through the port of New York in the spring of 1946, wrote in his memoir that the skyline of Manhattan, glimpsed for the second time from the deck of a ship, the first time as a prisoner arriving, the second time as a free man departing, looked to him like the skyline of a city he was leaving, not a city he was escaping. The long-term legacy of the American POW program is a subject that historians have studied with increasing intensity since the 1970s, when the first generation of German memoirists who had passed through American camps began to publish their accounts, and the conclusions they have reached are striking. A measurable proportion of the Germans who spent time in American prisoner of war camps emerged from the experience with genuinely altered political and social values. Studies conducted in West Germany in the 1950s found that former American prisoners were significantly more likely than other veterans to participate in democratic political processes, to join the new post-war trade unions, to support the institutions of the Federal Republic, and to express positive attitudes toward the United States and toward democratic governance in general. The men who had run the re-education program had hoped for exactly this outcome, and the evidence suggests they achieved it, at least in part, though the mechanisms of change were as much the bowl of ice cream and the Nebraska farm family and the Georgia sunset as they were any formal program of intellectual instruction. Among the men who returned to Germany, a significant number eventually made their way back to the United States through legal immigration channels, particularly after the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952 rationalized the immigration process and made it possible for former enemy aliens to apply for permanent residence. They came as engineers, as farmers, as craftsmen, as academics, as small business owners, settling in communities across the country, some of them within reach of the camps where they had first encountered America as prisoners. Their stories are largely invisible in the standard histories of post-war immigration, subsumed into the broader narrative of mid-century European immigration, but they constitute a quietly remarkable epilogue to the POW program, the final human resolution of an experiment that nobody had quite planned and nobody fully predicted. What is perhaps most striking about the entire episode, when you step back from the individual stories and try to take in its full dimensions, is what it reveals about the nature of ideological belief and the conditions under which it can change. The men who arrived in American camps in 1943 and 1944 were not, for the most part, monsters. They were ordinary men who had been formed by extraordinary circumstances, by the trauma of Weimar, by the seductive certainties of National Socialism, by the brutalizing experience of modern industrial warfare, and who had, within the framework of those circumstances, done things they would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand. The America that received them was not a perfect society. It was a country still practicing legal racial segregation in many of the states where the camps were located, a country with its own profound moral contradictions, a country that was in the process of interning its own citizens of Japanese descent, even as it treated German prisoners with exemplary correctness. The prisoners noticed this contradiction, and the more thoughtful among them wrote about it with considerable acuity, recognizing in the gap between American ideals and American practice something both troubling and, paradoxically, reassuring. Reassuring because a society that aspired to ideals it had not yet fully achieved was at least a society capable of aspiration, which was more than could be said for the one they had left behind. The story of the German prisoners who begged to stay in America is, in the end, a story about what happens when the wall between enemy and human being is breached, when the mechanisms of ideology fail against the stubborn weight of direct experience, when a man who has been told his enemy is subhuman sits down at a table with that enemy and eats a meal and discovers that the food tastes the same. It is a story about the power of abundance and decency and ordinary human contact to accomplish what no amount of battlefield victory could achieve on its own. The quiet, irreversible transformation of a mind. And it is a story that carries, in our own moment, a weight that goes well beyond its historical particularity, because the questions it raises about how beliefs form and how they change, about what it takes to make an enemy into something more complicated than an enemy, about the relationship between material reality and ideological conviction, those questions have not aged a single day. The men who stood at the rails of those transport ships in 1945 and 1946, watching America recede, were carrying something home with them that no customs declaration could have named, the lived knowledge that the world their leaders had promised them was false, and the lived knowledge of what a different world might feel like. Some of them would plant that knowledge in the soil of the new Germany and watch it grow into something durable. Some of them would eventually come back across the ocean and plant it in American soil instead. And some of them would carry it quietly inside themselves for the rest of their lives. A private truth too large and too strange to speak aloud. The memory of a country that had held them prisoner and, in doing so, had set them free.